June 1941. The Wehrmacht is on the move. East. All Soviet tanks so far have proven ineffective against the German war machine. Here is another. They fire with their 20mm light weapons. The shots just bounce off. Not even the 37mm Pak 36 has any effect. Only when the monster stops does a soldier disable it. It's like nothing they've ever seen before. The history of the KV tank goes back to just before the Winter War with Finland. The Red Army was after a replacement of the T-35 tank, and required a tank to have armour thick enough to withstand point-blank range shots from a 75mm shell. The original design called for a 5-turreted tank similar to the T-35. However, the designers persuaded the main Doctorate of the Armoured and Mechanical Forces, the GABTU, to omit the 2 small machine gun turrets from the design. Again, while designing the tank, the engineers sought to remove the second small anti-tank gun turret, which they did successfully. It is said that Stalin himself saw a model of the concept tank and snapped off one turret, proclaiming, "We are trying to make a tank, not a department store." 2 design teams were chosen to design the new tank: the Bakayarov Bureau at the Bolshevik plant and the Special Design Bureau 2, the SKB-2, at the Kirovsky in Leningrad. The Bakirov came up with the design T-100. It had 8 rubber-rimmed road wheels, torsion bar suspension, 1 turret with a 45mm gun, and a main turret with a 76.2mm gun. SKB-2 came up with the SMK, the Sergei M. Kirov. This tank had 8 road wheels with internal shock absorbers, torsion bar suspension, a turret with a 45mm gun, and a main turret with a 76.2mm gun. The suspension was tested on a T-28 tank with a new lower hull and different styles of road wheels in each suspension arm. SKB-2 was not happy with the design specifications for the tank, so they ventured on a private project. They removed the 45mm gun turret from the design and put the gun next to the 76mm gun in the main turret. They also redesigned the hull and increased the armour. The tank was nicknamed KV after Clementy Vorshilov. All 3 tanks were shown to the GABTU and Stalin. All 3 tanks were given the green light for prototype stage. Russia in 1940 invades the Karelia Isthmus and starts the war with Finland. The war is not going well for the Red Army, mostly being stuck in front of the Mannheim line. The disastrous spectacle of the Russians call them to use some of their prototype designs against the fortifications. All 3 tanks were sent to the front with the 20th Heavy Tank Battalion. The SMK was disabled while attacking the Velkin bunker. It rolled over a large mine that buckled the hull. The KV and T-100 guarded the tank as the recovery work was done. However, the SMK was not recovered until after the conflict, and even then the tank had to be dismantled piece by piece. Combat experience confirmed earlier trials that the SMK and T-100 was sluggish and hard to drive compared with the KV tank. The KV-1 was given the green light for production after some minor changes. The KV-1 was first produced with an L-11 gun. The tank had a crew of 5, which was unusual for Russian tanks with 1 turret. The tank was powered by a V2K diesel engine, which was underpowered for the job. The armour was incredibly thick for the day, 90mm on the front of the turret. These tanks are known as KV-1 Model 1939. Soon after the first tanks were made, they were upgraded with an F-32 gun. These tanks are known as KV-1 Model 1940. It was these 2 tanks that were to bear the brunt of the Germans during 1941, along with the KV-2, which we will discuss later. However, the KV had many flaws. The tank was very slow and underpowered. The tank had to stop to change gear. To change gear, the driver had to use a hammer to move the gear stick. The assistant gunner in the turret was often without a job, as he was seated at the back of the turret and got in the way of the loader and the commander. In addition, the tank was too heavy for most Russian bridges, and often supplies of ammunition and fuel were dire. This being said, the KV caused an uproar throughout the Wehrmacht. However, pre-war German reports clearly mentioned the KV and T-34 before the invasion. It was most likely ignored or deemed not important. The first effort to upgrade the tank was soon after the invasion. Some KV-1s were upgraded to EH standard. This by welding hexagonal bolts onto the turret and attaching armour plates to them. This was successful in the sense that no German tank could penetrate the armour of the tank. However, the weight was such now that the tank was more difficult to drive and could barely cross any bridge in Russia. Again in 1941, some KVs had a new, simpler designed turret fitted with a squared-off bustle. This was to speed up production. These tanks are known as KV-1 Model 1940 Simplified. It was in late 1941 that the first tanks were fitted with ZIS-5 76.2mm guns. In addition, there were new road wheels introduced. These tanks are called KV-1 Model 1941. In late October 1941, new cast turrets were made for the tank. This increased armour thickness. These tanks are known as KV-1 Model 1941 Cast. In mid-spring 1942, new hulls with 200mm frontal armour were fielded. These tanks have squared-off rear hull armour. Also produced was a simplified weld turret. Not all tanks with 200mm armour had a new turret though. These tanks are known as KV-1 Model 1942. At about the same time, a new, lighter weight cast turret was made for the KVs. This had a distinctive armoured ring around the rear turret MG, and now overhung the hull ever so slightly. These tanks are called KV-1 Model 1942 Cast, sometimes called lightweight cast. In mid-1942, there was a major effort to redesign the KV tank to improve its combat weight and speed. The new KV was called the KV-1S. The KV-1S had a completely redesigned turret with a command coupler. The tank now had many handles on board for infantry. The engine and transmission was updated, and the engine deck was now at a shallow gradient. The new tank was an improvement when we look at speed and reliability. However, the thinner armour of the turret was ineffective against the new German tanks arriving as the KV-1S was. It was due to the poor timing of the KV-1S that the KV series was cancelled, but not before 150 KV-85s were built. The last true KV tank, the KV-85, was the forerunner to the Joseph Stalin series tanks. It had a D85mm gun in the same turret that was on the JS-1 tank. The tank was an interim design as the Red Army was waiting for deliveries of JS-1 tanks. The KV-2 was one of the first subtypes of KV that was built in large numbers. It was first built during the Winter War, but was too late to see action. The KV Bolshny-Bolansky big turret was a KV-1 hull with a 12-ton turret with a 152mm howitzer, designed to destroy pillboxes and as a direct fire support weapon. 4 pre-production tanks were made with a 7-sided turret with a pronounced angled front plate. 20 more production tanks were made in this arrangement. After this, the KV-2 was produced. This had a 10-ton hexagonal slab-sided turret with a 152mm gun. The tank was produced all the way up until October 1941. The KV-2 was a shock to the Wehrmacht, although all the problems in the KV-1 were magnified in the KV-2, even to the point where climbing a shallow gradient would cause the turret to turn to the rear due to the weight of the gun. And if you were very unlucky, you might even cause the tank to tumble. However, there are cases where the KV-2 performed well. One KV-2 stopped the entire 13th Panzer Division for 48 hours in June 1941. as it pinned them down at a crossroads. The tank was eventually destroyed, but this one example shows how well-trained crews could achieve. No KV-2 was in service with the Red Army after 1941. However, there is at least one in service with the Wehrmacht up until 1943, when the tank was destroyed by its own crew after breakdown at the Battle of Kursk. There were many KV types that never reached production level, some only ever appearing on paper. The KV-3 was an attempt to put a 107mm gun in a static turret. The KV-4 was an attempt to revive the SMK and T-100 formula with 2 turrets. The KV-5 was a second attempt to follow the SMK formula. The KV-6 almost reached production. It was a flamethrower equipped tank, with a flamethrower in the hull next to the driver. There were 6 prototypes, one of which fell into German hands. The KV-7 was an attempt to follow the German line of assault guns based on pre-existing chassis. The KV-8 was the only mass-produced KV with a flamethrower. What makes the KV-8 special was it had a 45mm gun instead of a 76.2mm gun with a dummy barrel. There was even a KV-8S with the KV-1S turret and a flame unit. The KV-9 was another attempt to put a howitzer in a KV tank, this time a 122mm gun in a turret almost identical to the standard KV-1 1942 cast turret. The KV-12 was another attempt to make a flame-thrown tank. The KV-13 was an attempt to marry the T-34's manoeuvrability with the KV-1's armour. It does look like the 2 tanks combined. The KV-122 was another interim design that had the hull of a KV-85 and the turret of a JS-2. Object 220 was an attempt to upgun the KV-2 and turn it into a tank destroyer. The KV tanks were used on the Eastern Front up until the fall of Berlin and the surrender of German Army Group Kurland. Some KVs were converted into armoured recovery vehicles. Although crews disliked the tank, and it was prone to breakdowns, the KV-1 was one of the great Soviet tanks of World War II. It was a direct result of the KV-1 that the German army decided to produce a new tank that had the same or similar features as the KV. The T-34 influenced the German Panzer tank, whereas the KV's influence? You may know it as the Panzerkampfwagen 6, or its more common name, Tiger.